The moment he said, "Sit down," I knew I wasn't leaving that office the same woman who had walked in. The leather chair was expensive, the kind you sink into and can't quite get back out of gracefully. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that I didn't want to wrinkle my skirt. Like that mattered. Like anything about my appearance mattered when Dominic Vane was standing across from me with a manila folder on his desk, and eyes that told me he already knew everything. "I've been patient, Sarah." His voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. Not the anger, but the quiet beneath it. "But patience has a limit. And you crossed mine this morning." On the desk between us, he opened the folder. A single photograph. Me outside a Tim Hortons on King Street West, sitting across from a man in a gray jacket. A detective. A man I hadn't chosen to meet. My throat tightened. How had my life come to this? 3 months ago, I was Seraphine Okafor, 28 years old. Single mother to a 5-year-old boy named Emile, working the morning shift at Margot, a private dining club in downtown Toronto, where the minimum spend per table was more than my monthly grocery bill. I took the job because the tips were the only thing keeping us in our apartment on Dovercourt, keeping Emile in his asthma medication, keeping the lights on after his father. My ex, a man named Curtis, had stopped returning my calls and started returning my court notices unopened. I should not have been anywhere near Dominic Vane. He came in on a Wednesday in October, which was unusual. Wednesdays at Margot were quiet. The suits came on Thursdays, the old money on Fridays. Wednesday evenings were for the members who didn't want to be seen. I noticed him the way you notice a shift in weather before the clouds actually arrive. The room changed. Conversations dropped half a register. The sommelier materialized without being called. My manager, a brittle woman named Francesca, appeared at my elbow. "Table 4, she said without looking at me. "Mr. Vane. He asked for you specifically. He doesn't know me. He asked for the woman who recommended the lamb last week." She handed me a menu that didn't need handing. "Don't keep him waiting." I hadn't even noticed him last week. The table had been a walk-in, a group of 4, and I'd only stopped by once. But apparently once had been enough. He was sitting alone. 2 men in dark jackets stood near the entrance. Not eating, not drinking, just watching the room the way men watch rooms when they're paid to. Dominic Vane himself looked nothing like I'd expected. I'd heard the name before, the way you hear names in Toronto, without ever quite attaching them to a face. Real estate. Construction. Something about the waterfront development deals that kept cycling through city council. There had been a story in the Globe a few years back, something about a federal probe that went nowhere. I hadn't read it carefully. In person, he was younger than the name implied. Early to mid-30s, dark-complexioned, jaw sharp enough to cast a shadow. He was looking at his phone when I approached, and he didn't look up immediately when I said good evening. He let the silence sit for a moment. Not rudely, just deliberately. Like a man who knew exactly how many seconds he could make you stand there before it became uncomfortable. Then he looked up. "You're the one who recommended the rack of lamb." "I am." "Why?" It wasn't a question I'd been asked before. I told him the truth, that the chef sourced from a farm in Prince Edward County, that the fat rendered differently from imported cuts, that it was the kind of thing worth paying attention to. He watched me for a moment longer than felt necessary. "All right," he said. "Bring me whatever you think is worth paying attention to tonight." It should have been a forgettable interaction. A generous man, a good tip, a busy Wednesday. But when I brought the charcuterie to start, he asked my name. When I brought the lamb, he said it was exactly as I'd described. When I brought the bill, he handed me a card without looking at the total and said, "The recommendation was worth it." The tip was $400 on a $300 bill. I stood in the back hallway staring at the receipt for a long time. The following Wednesday, he was back. He asked for my section. He ordered what I suggested and spoke to me in the same careful, measured way, like I was someone whose opinion mattered, which was not how most of the people at Margot's tables spoke to me. The week after that, a car was waiting outside the restaurant at Close. A black Escalade with tinted windows, and a driver who handed me an envelope containing tickets to Emile's favorite performer, a children's musician who'd sold out Meridian Hall 3 months in advance. No note, no explanation needed. I should have returned them. I knew, in some reasonable corner of my mind, that I should have returned them and kept walking. Instead, I took Emil to the show and watched his face when the lights went down. And I told myself that was the last of it, that I wouldn't let it go further, that I understood the shape of what was happening, and I was choosing not to step inside it. I was lying to myself. Over the next 6 weeks, Dominic Vane came to Margot every Wednesday, sometimes Thursdays too. He sent flowers to my apartment, white freesia, which was my mother's favorite, and which I had never mentioned to anyone, least of all him. He had my car's winter tires replaced while it was parked in the lot at work. He arranged, through channels I still don't entirely understand, for Curtis to sign a consent order, giving me full decision-making authority over Emil's medical care, something my lawyer had been trying to negotiate for 8 months. Each time I tried to address it, the flowers, the tires, the legal document that appeared in my mailbox one morning, he deflected, not coldly, with a kind of easy certainty that suggested he considered these things self-evident. Like of course the tires needed changing, of course the consent order needed filing, like he'd simply noticed a problem and fixed it, the way you'd hold a door for someone whose hands were full. I told myself I was keeping my distance. I wasn't. Then came the Thursday evening in November, when he arrived at the restaurant looking different. Not disheveled. Dominic Vane was never disheveled. But something underneath the surface was wound differently. I brought him water, and he looked at me for a long moment before asking without preamble whether I trusted him. It was such a strange question that I answered honestly. Not yet, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Like that was the right answer. Like every other answer would have meant something was wrong. Fair, he said. He didn't eat much that night. He left early. And the following Monday, I got a call from Detective Ray Okoro of the Toronto Police Service, asking if we could meet for a coffee. I should have told Dominic. I know that now, the way you know things in retrospect with the clarity that costs you nothing because it's already too late. But Detective Okoro had used the word informal 3 times in a 5-minute phone call, and I'd agreed before I had time to think about what agreeing meant. We met at a Tim Hortons on King West because he'd suggested it, and I hadn't thought to suggest somewhere else. He was a compact man in his 40s, with the kind of face that seemed designed to be forgettable. He bought me a coffee I didn't drink, and told me, with the careful courtesy of a man delivering news he'd rehearsed, that I appeared to be developing a personal relationship with a man currently under surveillance by a joint federal-provincial task force for money laundering, bid rigging, and what he called associated activities. He slid a photograph across the table. Me at the children's concert, with Emil on my hip and Dominic standing beside us. His hand was at the small of my back. I hadn't even remembered that he'd been standing that close. We're not asking you to do anything complicated, Okoro said. We're asking you to keep your eyes open, to tell us what you see. He used the word protect 4 times. Emil's name twice. I left without agreeing to anything, but I also left without saying no, and Dominic had known, apparently, within 2 hours. Now I sat in his office on the 43rd floor of a building in the financial district, with the city spread out below us like something on a screen, and he was standing very still on the other side of his desk. And the quiet in the room had the specific texture of something about to break. It's not what you think, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Then tell me what it is. He moved around the desk, slow and deliberate, until he was standing just in front of me. He didn't touch me, he didn't need to. His presence was its own kind of pressure. Because from where I stand, the woman I've let into my life sat across from a police detective for 37 minutes this morning and didn't tell me. He approached me. I met his eyes because not meeting them felt like losing something. I didn't seek him out. He called. I agreed to a meeting without thinking, and then I sat there, and I listened, and I said nothing, and I left. Nothing. Nothing. I pressed my hands together in my lap to keep them still. He wanted me to act as an informant. I didn't agree. Dominic studied me for a long moment. I could hear my own heartbeat. What did he show you? He asked. A photograph, us at the concert. He said, you're under surveillance. I'm aware of the surveillance. He turned away, moving toward the wall of windows, and I watched the tension in his shoulders. The way a man carries something he's been carrying for a long time, so long it's become part of his posture. Okoro's task force has been building a case for 4 years. They haven't succeeded because they can't establish a direct link between my development companies and the financial structures they believe I'm connected to. Are they wrong? I asked. He turned back. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. No, he said. It was such a direct answer that it took me a moment to process it. I appreciate that you didn't run, he said, coming back toward me. And I appreciate that you said nothing to Okoro. But I need you to understand what that means, Sarah. What it means to know what you know and stay. I don't know anything. You know enough. He stopped in front of me. Close, but not close enough to be threatening. Just close enough to make the space between us feel intentional. Which means you have a choice to make. And I want you to make it clearly, not because you feel you have no options. I looked up at him. What choice? Walk away, he said. Right now, tonight. I'll make sure you and Emil are provided for. Your rent covered, his medical costs, a settlement that will let you stop working doubles and actually breathe for the first time in years. You'll never see me again, and Okoro can surveil all it likes without finding anything useful from your direction. Something cold moved through me at how easily he laid it out, like he'd prepared it, like he'd been prepared for this possibility since the beginning. Or, I asked, or you stay, and we have an honest conversation about what that means. I should have taken the first option. I should have taken it immediately, without hesitation, the way you make decisions that protect your child without needing to think about it. Instead, I was silent for too long, and Dominic saw it, and something in his expression, not quite relief, not quite hope, but somewhere between them, shifted. Why does any of this matter to you? I asked. Genuinely, I'm a server at a restaurant. You could have anyone. Why does it matter whether I stay or go? He was quiet for a long moment. Because you told me the lamb was worth paying attention to, he said, and it sounded ridiculous until it didn't. And then you were right. And I have spent a very long time in rooms full of people who tell me what they think I want to hear. And I had forgotten what it felt like when someone just told me the truth. I thought about Emil. I thought about the way Dominic had crouched down to Emil's height at the concert to explain how the stage lighting worked. Patient and detailed, like a child's curiosity, was a thing worth taking seriously. I thought about the consent order in my mailbox, how I'd cried in the kitchen at 2 a.m. when I read it, quietly, so Emil wouldn't hear. Where is Emil right now? I asked. A pause. Brief but deliberate. He's at my residence, Dominic said. My housekeeper, Adaze, collected him from your neighbor an hour ago. He's had dinner. He's watching a movie. The air went out of me. You took my son. I ensured his safety while his mother was meeting with law enforcement and hadn't told me. His voice was careful. Not cold, but careful. He doesn't know anything is wrong. He asked if you would be coming, and Adaze told him yes. You had no right. I know. The admission stopped me mid-breath. I know I didn't, and I'm telling you that plainly, because you deserve the honesty of it. I reacted from a place of fear, which is not something I say easily, and it was not the right response. But Emil is safe, and I need you to know that before anything else. I said that for a moment, the apology and the fear underneath it. Take me to him, I said. He nodded once and reached for his jacket. The drive uptown was silent. Dominic's building was on Bloor West, the kind of address that appears in architecture magazines and nowhere else. The lobby had the hushed quality of somewhere that took privacy seriously. We rode the elevator to the penthouse without speaking, and when the doors opened, I heard Emil before I saw him. His particular laugh, the one that still caught me off guard with how whole it was, unguarded in the way children are, before the world teaches them to guard themselves. He was on a sectional the size of my entire living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching something on a screen that took up most of one wall. Beside him sat a small plate of grapes, half finished, and on the floor was a building set that had not been there this morning. Mayman. He scrambled up, the blanket tangling around his feet, and launched himself at me, with the full-body confidence of a 5-year-old who has never once doubted his welcome. I held him tighter than was probably comfortable and breathed him in. His shampoo, the specific warmth of him. Adaze let me pick the movie, he informed me, already wriggling to get down. And she made jollof rice, and it was actually good, not like the kind from the can. I managed a laugh that only shook a little. Adaze was a tall woman in her 60s, with a composed, watchful kindness that reminded me of my mother's friends from back home, the kind of women who knew everything about a situation and chose carefully what to acknowledge. She met my eyes across the room with a brief, warm nod that somehow communicated both an apology and a reassurance. He was very well behaved, she said. He offered to help me in the kitchen. He likes kitchens, I said. I know, she said. And then, quietly, Mr. Vane told me. I looked at Dominic, who was standing back, giving me the space of it, watching Emile with the same expression I'd seen at the concert. Something opened that he didn't usually allow himself. Once Emile had been settled back into the film with a warning that bedtime was still bedtime, regardless of whose television it was. Adeze showed me to a sitting room with a view of the city below, and left us with tea I didn't ask for and didn't turn down. You prepared this, I said, once she was gone. You had a plan for bringing us here. I had a contingency, Dominic said, sitting across from me. There's a difference, is there? Yes. A plan suggests certainty. A contingency suggests preparation for a possibility I hoped not to need. He wrapped his hands around his mug, and I noticed for the first time that his hands were not the soft hands of a man who'd always had money. There were scars there, old ones. I have spent my entire life preparing for possibilities I hoped not to need. It becomes a reflex. I studied him. Tell me about your business, the real version. He held my gaze. My grandfather came to Canada from Barbados in 1971 with nothing. He worked construction. My father grew up in that world and built on it. Legitimately at first. Small contracts, city work, eventually larger development projects. He paused. And then at some point, the shortcuts became the method. Bid rigging, kickbacks, arrangements with city officials who looked the other way. By the time I understood what I'd inherited, the roots were deeper than I could simply cut. So you kept it going. I kept the company alive, he said, while I built the structures that would allow it to exist without the arrangements. It's not complete. It won't be for another year, perhaps 18 months. But it is happening. And the people who benefit from the old arrangements, I said, they're not enthusiastic about the changes. Something shifted in his expression. You're perceptive. I've been watching people across restaurant tables for 6 years. You learned to read a room. I set my mug down. Is that why Okoro is moving now? Because you're vulnerable in transition? Partly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a moment he looked less like the man who commanded every room he walked into, and more like someone who was simply tired. Okoro isn't the primary concern. The task force wants visibility into the old network. Names, transactions, relationships. They think you can give them that, can I? No, you've seen nothing. His eyes met mine. But they don't know that. And that makes you useful to them in a way that could become dangerous, depending on how they choose to proceed. I thought about the word protect that Okoro had used 4 times. The way he'd said Emile's name. He implied Emile could be at risk, I said, if I didn't cooperate. The temperature in the room dropped. He said that. Dominic's voice was very quiet, not directly, but the implication was there. He stood, moved to the window. The city below us glittered in the November dark, all that light suggesting a warmth that wasn't really there. I watched him collect himself, the precise, deliberate way he managed whatever was moving through him. Okoro has made a significant miscalculation, he said finally. I gathered. He turned back. You and Emile are under my protection from this moment. That is not conditional on any decision you make about us, about this. It is simply true, because he made it necessary. He crossed back to where I was sitting, and this time he sat beside me rather than across from me. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, because I think you're someone who can. All right, when Okoro laid out his offer, protection, cooperation, a way out, did you consider it? I could have deflected. I didn't. For about 30 seconds, I said, before I thought about what cooperation would actually mean, and what it would teach Emile about how we handle things when we're afraid. He was quiet for a long moment. My brother was killed when I was 19, he said. He was 22. He was the one who was supposed to inherit all of this, the business, the responsibility, the weight of what my father had built. He was better suited to it than I was. Steadier. He understood people in a way I had to learn. He paused. A deal went wrong. Someone my father trusted decided that removing the heir was easier than renegotiating terms. And I watched my father spend the next decade becoming someone I didn't recognize. Because he decided that grief was a thing to be processed through control, through expansion, through accumulating enough power that no one could take anything from him again. I didn't say I was sorry. It felt inadequate. Is that what you became? I asked instead. For a while, he looked at me steadily, until I realized that what he built that way was something that could only be maintained by fear. And fear is not a legacy. So what is? I don't know yet, he said. I'm still building it. Outside, the wind came off Lake Ontario and pressed against the glass. My father left when Emile was 3 months old, I said. Not because it was directly relevant, but because he'd told me something true and it felt like reciprocity. Curtis. He wasn't a bad person in the way people expect. He was just absent, not cruel, not violent, just quietly, persistently not there. And what I learned from that is that the most damaging thing isn't someone who hurts you. It's someone who makes you doubt whether you're worth the effort of staying. Dominic looked at me for a long moment. You are, he said. It was such a simple thing to say. I had to look away. We sat in silence for a while, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens when two people have said more than they expected and are letting it settle. What happens now? I asked. Now I take you and Emile home, if that's what you want. Or you stay here tonight, where I can ensure you're not approached by Okoro's people before I've had a chance to address the situation on my end. He looked at me. Either way, nothing changes without your agreement. That is something I should have led with tonight, and I didn't, and I'm aware of that. You're better at apologizing than I expected. I've had to learn it. A brief, wry quality to his voice. It didn't come naturally. I thought about Emile, already half asleep on the enormous sectional, unbothered, completely at ease in a penthouse he'd been in for 3 hours. Children had an instinct for safety that bypassed adult complication. He'd been comfortable here in a way that said something I hadn't asked him to say. We'll stay tonight, I said. But I want to be clear about something. Go ahead. I'm not agreeing to anything beyond tonight. I need time to understand what this is, and what it would mean for Emile, and whether the version of yourself you're describing is real, or whether it's the version you present to people you want to trust you. I held his gaze. I've been wrong about people before. I'd like to be more careful this time. That's reasonable, he said. And if at any point I feel that Emile is in danger, real danger, not managed danger, not calculated risk, we leave, without a conversation. Just gone, agreed. No hesitation. His safety is not a negotiating point. I nodded. We sat with the terms of it for a moment. You should know, he said after a pause, that Okoro's implication about Emile. I won't let that stand unanswered. What does that mean? It means that by end of week, he'll have enough of his own professional complications to redirect his attention. He said it without particular heat, the way you'd note a correction to a spreadsheet. He overstepped. There are consequences to that. I thought about asking what kind of consequences. I thought about how that conversation would go, what it would require of me to continue sitting here comfortably after the answer. I made a decision that felt like the first of many, choosing which questions to ask and which ones to leave alone, at least for now. Get some sleep, Dominic said. A daze will show you to the room next to Emile's. It has everything you need. She's efficient and thorough, and has been managing the details of my life since before I had any details worth managing. I stood. He stood with me. Can I ask you one more thing tonight? Yes, the concert, I said. The tickets. How did you know it was sold out? How did you know he even liked her? For just a moment, something almost embarrassed crossed his face. It was startling, on a face that didn't usually allow itself to be startled into anything. Emile was wearing a shirt with her logo on it, the Tuesday I saw you outside the restaurant. You were picking him up from a neighbor. He was telling you about a song he'd learned. He paused. I asked my assistant to look into whether she toured. The rest followed. I stared at him. You noticed a 5-year-old's shirt. I notice things, he said simply, especially things that matter to you. I went to bed that night in a room that smelled like expensive linen and fresh air, in a building high enough to be above the city's noise. And I lay in the dark and thought about all the reasons this was impossible. The list was substantial. The risk was real. The man in the next corridor was not safe in any of the ways the word usually meant. And still I thought about his hands, the scars on them, the story they suggested without telling it. Still, I thought about him crouching down to Emile's level at the concert, explaining the spotlights. Still, I thought about the consent order in my mailbox and the 2 a.m. kitchen, and crying quietly so my son wouldn't hear. By the time I finally slept, I knew that the decision I'd told myself I was deferring had already been made somewhere I wasn't admitting to yet. I just needed a little longer before I said it out loud. 7 months later, the Vane Foundation opened the Olusegun Vane Community Arts Center in Scarborough, named for Dominic's brother. It was the kind of building that looked like it had been built to last, which was, Dominic told me, entirely the point. The foundation had funded 3 others across the GTA in the preceding year, all in neighborhoods where his family's development companies had built their earliest, least examined contracts. He'd told me once, with the particular flatness he used for things that cost him something to say, that it wasn't reparation. That reparation wasn't possible, but it was what he could do now, with what he had. I had come to understand the difference between those two things. We lived by then in a house in the east end of the city, a Victorian semi in Leslieville that Dominic had found, he claimed, because of the backyard, which was true. But the backyard had been less relevant than the school around the corner, and the fact that the neighbors were unremarkable in all the right ways. Emile had a room with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and a small piano against one wall and a dog named Zisket, who had opinions about everything and shed on every surface, regardless of how recently it had been vacuumed. Emile called Dominic by his name, which had been my preference, and which Dominic had accepted without question and apparently without minding. They had a specific dynamic that I had not engineered and had learned to stay out of. Architectural explanations, long walks where Dominic identified buildings by decade, a shared and serious investment in a particular kind of chess opening that I did not understand. The business had cleared its final restructuring in the spring. The task force investigation had closed without charges, which I hadn't asked too many questions about, which was a choice I'd made consciously and made peace with over time. Okoro had transferred to a position in Ottawa the previous winter. Curtis had moved to Edmonton and sent birthday cards, which was more than I'd expected and less than Emile deserved, but it was what it was. We were in the kitchen, Dominic making coffee, Emile theoretically doing homework at the table, but actually drawing spaceships on the margins, when he said, quietly, not making a production of it, that he had something he wanted to ask me. Emile looked up from his spaceships. "You can keep drawing," Dominic told him. "This concerns you too, but it's a conversation, not an announcement. You don't have to perform being interested." Emile considered this. "Can I keep drawing while you talk?" "Yes." He went back to the spaceships. Dominic set 2 mugs on the counter and looked at me in the particular way. He looked at me when he'd thought carefully about something and was about to say it. He was not a man who spoke before he was ready. I had learned to wait. "I would like us to be married," he said. "Not immediately, not on a timeline, not with any particular production. But I want you to know that's what I want. If you want it too, we figure out the rest. If you don't, we don't change what we have." I looked at him. Then I looked at Emile, who was definitely still listening while drawing a very detailed rocket. "What do you think?" I asked him. Emile looked up. He appeared to give it genuine consideration, in the way he gave things genuine consideration. The same way he had apparently once asked Dominic at length about the structural properties of concrete. "I think yes," he said. Then, to Dominic, "Would I still have the same room?" "You would have the same room," Dominic confirmed. "And possibly also a loft." "A loft," Emile repeated, with the specific tone of a person whose position has been substantially strengthened. I laughed. It started somewhere deep and came out whole, the kind of laugh that doesn't need explaining. Dominic was looking at me with that expression I'd spent 7 months learning how to receive. The one that said I was the most interesting thing in whatever room we were in, which was not something I had ever expected to be to a man like him, or to anyone, and which I had slowly, cautiously, allowed myself to believe was simply true. "Yes," I said. He didn't reach for me immediately. He just stood there for a moment with that in the air between us, like he was making sure it was real before he moved toward it. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of my face and kissed me with a gentleness that still surprised me, even after all this time. Behind us, Emile made a sound of mild theatrical displeasure that was entirely performative. "Can we get a second dog?" he asked. "Absolutely not," Dominic said, without breaking the kiss. "We'll revisit it," I said. "That means yes," Emile told Biscuit. Outside, it was the kind of May evening that Toronto saves for the days when you've almost stopped believing in it. The light turning everything gold, the cherry trees on the street still holding their last blossoms, the city making its best argument for itself. Inside, my son was drawing spaceships and making alliances with the dog, and the man I had once been terrified to want was holding my face like I was something he'd searched for, long enough that he wasn't ready to let go yet. That was 7 months of cautious and complicated, and sometimes very difficult, and occasionally frightening. 7 months of choosing, over and over, to stay in a room that asked more of me than any room I'd been in before. I would not have changed a single one of those days.